Welcome again. Welcome everyone from wherever you are joining us. I am Silvia Garcia-Pereira, and I am a teacher with Insight Meditation Community of Washington. It brings me great joy to be moderating this session with dear teacher Joseph Goldstein. We are happy you are here with us live today, but also knowing that many more of you will be watching the recording. Again, welcome everyone. This is the second Sunday Dharma series, a fundraiser for the Insight Meditation Community of Washington, D.C. We come together on the second Sunday of every month to spend time getting to know an inspiring Dharma teacher, learning from their wisdom, their practice, and what's most important to them. Next month, on July 12th, our dear teacher Rick Kohler will be speaking with Michelle Cassandra Johnson about her latest book, Finding Refuge: Hard Work for Healing Collective Grief. Before we begin, we want to let you know about important details. Dinah Hobbs is providing ASL interpretation. And you may also select CC on the Zoom menu to start closed captioning. And we would also like to encourage you, if possible, to keep your camera on, as this can help to foster a sense of community. And about questions during our time together, you will have the opportunity to ask questions for Joseph. And if you can please address them to ask questions here on the chat, and we will try to get to as many as possible today. And now we are honored and grateful to introduce to you Joseph Goldstein. Joseph has been an essential figure in bringing Buddhism, meditation, and mindfulness to the West. He is a co-founder and guiding teacher of Insight Meditation Society, IMS, in Barre, Massachusetts. He has been teaching Vipassana and Metta retreats worldwide since 1974. And he's the author of numerous popular books, such as Mindfulness, A Practical Guide to Awakening, One Dharma, The Experience of Insight, to name a few. Personally, I have been blessed to have him as a teacher on many retreats, and he has been most influential in my growth in the Dharma. So it is with deep gratitude that we welcome Joseph, and thank you, Joseph, for your presence here. You're muted, Joseph.
Okay, I think that's one of the most common lines on Zoom meetings. You're muted. It's really a pleasure to be with all of you today. I thought we would start just with a very brief meditation, maybe 5 minutes or so, as a chance just to settle in, relax into the awareness, of one's body, becoming present as best we can. So if you just take a comfortable meditation posture, whatever it may be, simply settle into the awareness of the whole body. Sit and know you're sitting. And as you're settling into the body, you may become aware of the sensations of the body breathing. Simply be aware when you're breathing in, know you're breathing in. When you're breathing out, know you're breathing out. You can keep it that simple. Breathing in, know you're breathing in. Breathing out, know you're breathing out. You may also become mindful of different sensations appearing in the body, or sounds. Simply notice them when they become predominant. Settle back into the awareness of the body and the breath. See if you can notice and become aware of any thoughts or images that appear in the mind. You could make a soft mental note of thinking or seeing if that's helpful, and simply letting them come and go. Staying relaxed in the awareness of the body, and letting the breathing find its own natural rhythm.
Thank you so much for that, Joseph. So I thought, as a way of our community of friends who are here, so they can get to know you, if you can share what attracted you to the practice and how did you discover the Dharma?
Mm-hmm. Well, so when I finished college, I went into the Peace Corps. This was in 1965, and they sent me to Thailand, where I was teaching English in Bangkok. And at school, I was studying philosophy. So when I was in Thailand, which of course is a Buddhist country, at first I just had a kind of philosophic interest in the Buddhist teachings. I really didn't know anything about them at all. And I started going to discussion groups at one of the famous temples. But given my training in philosophy, I went to these groups and just asked endless questions. People stopped coming because I went, because I was asking so many questions. So I think one of the monks who was leading the groups, at some point, I think perhaps out of desperation, he said, Joseph, why don't you try meditating? And of course, I knew nothing about it. I was young. I was in Asia for the first time. It was all very exotic. So he gave me the basic, very simple instructions. I get my paraphernalia together, and I set my alarm clock for 5 minutes because I didn't want to sit too long. But quite amazingly, something really happened in that first 5 minutes, and it wasn't any great enlightenment experience. But what I saw was that there was a way to look into the mind as well as looking out through it. And that to me was revelatory, that there was a methodology for looking into one's own mind. I got very excited by that. I got so excited that I started inviting my friends over to watch me meditate. But of course, they didn't come back too often until now. So I'm glad you've come to watch. So that was the beginning. And then I was very enamored of just the whole process, even though it was just the very beginning exploration. After the Peace Corps, I came back to the States, wanted to continue, and realized I needed a teacher. And so then I decided I'll go back to Asia, I'll look for a meditation teacher. Ended up, after some travels, in Bodh Gaya, which of course is the place of the Buddhist enlightenment, where I met my first teacher, Munindraji. And he just said something at the very first meeting which completely captured my attention. He said, if you want to understand your mind, sit down and observe it. And that was all, the common senseness of that statement. There was nothing to join, there were no rituals, there were no ceremonies. It was just a direct looking into one's own mind as a way of understanding our minds and our hearts and our lives. And that was it. I spent most of the next 7 years in India, with a couple of visits back to the States, just continuing my practice. And then came back in 1974 and began teaching. So that's in brief the story.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so, and also probably over the years, of course, your practice has changed, but we know that you often go on self-retreats, and that is something that, of course, enriches your Dharma experience and your insights, and often your students benefit from those insights. So I was wondering, because I know you just came from a retreat, if you can please share if there were any new insight in this last retreat, anything that has come up for you new that you can share with us?
So something did come up. It wasn't so much a new insight as a deepening way of understanding an old insight. And so when I was on retreat, instead of listening to different Dharma talks, in the evening, what I was doing was listening to the Buddha's suttas, discourses, which are all on Audible, so you can actually be listening to them. And I find that that's a really powerful way of absorbing the teachings. It's quite a different experience than reading.
Yeah.
So I was listening just to some of the discourses. And there was one line in one of the discourses that I must have read many, many times over the years. But when I heard it, it just had a different impact. So it was very simple, extremely simple. The Buddha was talking about the nature of impermanence and the nature of change. And he used a very unusual phrase, at least unusual in English. I don't know what it was in Pali, but in English, it was just an unusual combination of words. So he said, everything has the nature to change, to become otherwise. And it was that phrase, becoming otherwise. Everything has the nature of becoming otherwise, other than it is, which is really just another way of saying things change. But we've heard that so often that I think it often doesn't have that much impact. Oh yes, everything changes, we know that. But very often we're just knowing it on a conceptual and intellectual level because it's so familiar to us. But when I heard these words, everything has the nature to change, becoming otherwise, it's almost like it made the truth of change, the momentary change, so vivid. Everything is always becoming otherwise, which reveals or reminds us that essentially there's no stability in phenomena. Like we can't take refuge in things staying the same way because they're always becoming otherwise. And I found that phrase coming to my mind very often throughout the day. So I would be going and just doing some walking meditation perhaps. And, maybe after a little time, I'd feel a little pain or discomfort in my knee. As soon as that arose, becoming otherwise, right? So it reminded me, instead of perhaps my more usual response, why did this happen? Or why me, or whatever. No, it's the nature of things, always becoming otherwise. I was in my house and something broke. Becoming otherwise. And so it's actually very freeing, to have that insight into impermanence made vivid in the moment, reminding, this is how things are. And it's very freeing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you, Joseph. Yeah, that's really a different way of seeing change and experiencing it. Yeah. Thank you. So one thing that I would like to also maybe if you can share, because mindfulness has become so popular that in non-Buddhist circles, like we've heard evangelical pastors talk about mindfulness. There's even a mindful Barbie. Yes. So I would like to, if you can address, like maybe the essential of what is mindfulness and maybe the difference between mindfulness and attention. And also maybe talk a little bit about the ethical dimension of as a foundation of the Dharma and mindfulness, which is, of course, often not included.
Right. So we should probably take those one at a time so I remember
Okay.
all the questions embedded. But at some point, I'd love to know how they made the Barbie mindful.
I'm sorry, I don't have it, but
That's very intriguing.
Yes.
So first, just this is a little bit technical, but the difference between attention and mindfulness. And it's explained quite clearly in the Abhidhamma, which is the Buddhist psychology, which analyzes all of these particular different mental factors. And attention, interestingly enough, is what is called a common factor. So attention is there in every moment. It's really what allows us to have any kind of awareness of the moment's experience. If we're not paying attention. So just as an example, we might be going for a walk and then lost in a thought. And in all that time we're lost in a thought, we're not really seeing what's around us. And I'm sure you've probably had that experience. We're kind of lost in our own inner world for a few moments, and we miss what's around us because there's no attention on what's being seen at that time. The attention is on the thought. So attention is always present. It's just what connects us to the moment's experience. Mindfulness is a different factor. So along with attention, when mindfulness is present, then we not only know what the object is, but we're experiencing it in a very particular way. And that particular way is that in that moment of mindfulness, we're aware of what's happening without greed, without attachment, without aversion, without ignorance. Right? So the mindfulness is, we could say, in a way, is purifying that quality of attention. Right? And it's because we're seeing things without the filter of those defilements, of greed, hatred, and delusion, we're able to see more clearly the nature of that experience. And so it's really the vehicle for insight. When we're simply in the realm of attention without mindfulness, we're going through the day, but we're not necessarily seeing clearly the real nature of phenomena, the changing nature, or the selfless nature. All of that comes through mindfulness. So they're really quite different factors. Mm-hmm. In terms of the ethical foundation for mindfulness, this is really important. And in a way, it ties into one other aspect of your question about the whole secular mindfulness movement, which is really, I think it's a wonderful thing, and clearly people are getting a lot of benefit from it. There could be a limitation in the understanding that comes from it, if it doesn't also point to the deepening wisdom that's possible, to see that mindfulness in its fullness is the path to liberation, is the path to freedom, to awakening. So perhaps some teachers in the secular mindfulness world, bring that in, and maybe some don't. But I think that's really important for us in terms of us being Dharma practitioners to understand the really depth of what the mindfulness practice can bring. In this regard, the ethical foundation, in Pali Sila, following the precepts, is so important. And it's important for many reasons. One, it's really a protection for us from harmful actions, which will bring karmically unfortunate results. So when we take the precepts, not to kill or not to steal or not committing sexual misconduct, or all the precepts around right speech or not clouding the mind. When we take the precepts and even take them in a formal way, what I found is that it acts like a kind of mindfulness bell if we're about to do something that's going to break the precepts. So just a very simple example, which perhaps might come up for many of you, even if we're not going around killing and stealing, but an arena where it's so impactful, I find, is in the whole area of right speech, because we talk a lot in the course of a day. It's a prevalent form of our communication. But I think very often we're not really being that mindful of what we're about to say before we say it. Words seem to come just tumbling out of our mouths. If we've taken the precept, about right speech, not lying, not harsh speech, not gossiping, not useless talk, just having taken the precept, what I found is if I'm about to say something, maybe in a social gathering, that is totally useless. And this is one of my favorite ones. And just to mention, the Pali word for useless talk, I think is my very favorite word in Pali. It's sampapalapa. Because the word in Pali sounds just like what it is. Useless talk. Sampapalapa. So when I, just hanging out with friends, and if I'm about to sampapalap, very often, having taken the precept, not always, but often, it's like, oh, that little bell goes off. Oh, I don't have to do this. I don't have to give voice to that. It's useless. And so there's a moment of restraint, wise restraint, and it feels good. It feels... It shows the liberating power of what renunciation means, right? Because there's that impulse to say something, not that skillful. If we're mindful, and here's mindfulness is the key, and the precepts of having taken them, it no, I don't have to go with that. I don't have to say that. And so it's just a very powerful foundation for the practice. And even more directly for our meditation practice, if we're following the precepts or basic ethical framework of non-harming, it keeps our hearts and minds free of remorse. Because I'm sure we've all had experiences in our lives in looking back at unskillful things we've done and feeling remorse about it. And regret. And this kind of remorse or regret really is an agitation for the mind. It's very hard for the mind to concentrate when there is a lot of remorse going on. Well, from the time we've taken the precepts and really try to follow them, we're freeing the mind from that pattern of remorse. And it's so... uplifting and stabilizing and purifying in a way. So in this regard also, the precepts, the ethical foundation, really is a help for the deepening of our concentration and deepening of our wisdom. So in all these ways, the ethics and the precepts and non-harming is just such a key part of Dharma practice. And of living the practice in our lives.
Yeah, thank you. I also find that in terms of speech, that often speech for me can be a way of not being present as well. It's a way of escaping from being, or from reaffirming the sense of self also.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
it's a lot. Speech is like very, very rich
Yeah.
to investigate.
It's just interesting also one to follow up on that a little bit. You know, the Buddha made this list. He gave this list of the 10 unwholesome actions, you know, like killing and stealing, things like obvious. But of the 10 unwholesome actions that the Buddha highlighted, 4 of them have to do with speech. You know, and we tend, I think, very often to think of our Dharma practice as meditation. You know, okay, this is the real Dharma practice, and the rest of our lives, you know, we try the best we can. But here the Buddha is really highlighting this very important part of our lives as being central, as being key. And so I think it really is worth a lot of exploration and practice.
Yeah, so to retake something you just said about before with the previous question, I think when we were talking about mindfulness and your book, Mindfulness, the title is Mindfulness, A Practical Guide to Awakening. So how do we practice with no expectations when we know that the ultimate goal is awakening?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so this is an important question. I think it's really helpful to distinguish between aspirations and expectations, because these are 2 very different mind states. Aspiration, we can have an aspiration for enlightenment. We can have an aspiration to become more compassionate or more loving. So it sets a direction for us, right? So we're not just wandering around in some confused way. We actually have an aspiration for a particular goal. And goal is not a bad word. You know, sometimes people think, oh, one shouldn't have goals in practice. The Eightfold Path is a path that leads someplace. You know, so right from the very beginning, at the heart of the teachings, the Buddha is talking about having a wise goal, which is liberating ourselves, you know, from the forces of greed and hatred and delusion. So having that aspiration, I think, can be a tremendous source of clarity and energy in our practice. Expectation is something quite different and is a hindrance. Expectation means that we want things to be a certain way when we want them to be. You know, so we have an expectation for a particular sitting, which most of you know, who have experience in meditation, know that that is totally futile, because we can have whatever expectation we want, but the Dharma will just unfold in its natural way. So to have an expectation, oh, I don't want any pain in this sitting, or I want my mind just not to be restless, that just sets up a condition for suffering, right? So the balance of this is to have the aspiration, which sets the direction, and then to settle into, you know, our practice and unfolding, being mindful of however it unfolds. Right? And that way we stay freer in the process. We're not setting up a cause for unnecessary suffering in our practice or in our lives. Because usually, in terms of accomplishing the results that we want, there are so many forces at work in that, you know, so many different conditions that have to come together, some of which are in our control, some are not. So if we're free of expectations, then we can be responsive in a really skillful way to whatever's arising. You know, we're sitting and maybe we're dealing with physical pain or emotional pain, right? That may not fit our expectation, but if we're free of expectation, then we can learn how to deal skillfully with them in the service of our aspiration.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I just think that distinction is very helpful.
Yes. So, but would you say that is there like a momentary awakening? Like, is awakening possible? Is it? I know that the Buddha gave us a path to awakening, but I think it can be like something that we see as unreachable, but at the same time, there are experiences when we feel that there is momentary awakening. Is that something possible?
Yeah, it's very possible. And I'd like to just suggest an exercise which I have found really helpful in that regard to connect us even a little bit with what awakening means. So I'll just preface it by suggesting a really common experience, that many people have. The experience when you wake up in the morning, and we wake up first, and then maybe, on some mornings we drop back off to sleep, for another minute or a few minutes, and maybe enter into a dream state for those few minutes, and then we wake up again and we're really awake. Okay, so on one of my self-retreats, I was doing walking meditation, but in a relaxed way. It wasn't super slow. I was just walking at a kind of normal pace. And I began to notice something more vividly than I had in the past. And so as I was walking, I began to notice how many quickly passing thoughts would go through the mind that for the most part were unobserved because they were so quick and they were so light. They weren't dramatic, they weren't particularly impactful, just ordinary, just an ordinary thought going through. But what I began to see as I paid attention to those very light thoughts that were happening and beginning to pick them up, I saw that for the time that I was lost in the thought, even if it was just for 30 seconds or 15 seconds, whatever, for that time, it was the same experience as I described earlier of like dropping back into a dream state after we, awoke in the morning, awakened in the morning, because we're just dropping into the story of the thought, and it's not that the thought is necessarily unskillful or problematic. It can be a very light thought, but in not being aware that it's there, we've dropped back into a dream state. And then we come out of that and paying attention to the moment of coming out of that, it's like, oh, back to wakefulness, back to awareness. And so right in that moment, we have a very vivid personal experience of the difference between delusion and wisdom, right? Between being asleep and being awake. And what was so surprising to me is how often this happens, right? So an exercise that I really enjoy doing, and I would suggest if you're interested, you could try it. Just maybe it'll be on a walk, maybe just in the course of your other daily activities. Take just 5 minutes. So it's not a big, long project. Just 5 minutes setting the intention to keep an eye out for these quickly passing light thoughts and how the mind can drop into them and then come out of them. And notice the difference in the quality of your mind, right? When we're lost and when we're awake. So that really gives us a very immediate sense of the possibility of real wakefulness, of real understanding. And of course, from that's kind of a very accessible level. As our practice deepens, you mentioned just the aspiration for enlightenment. Of course, full enlightenment may be a way off for most of us, but enlightenment also goes in stages, and as our practice deepens, we get real, genuine tastes or intimations of that experience all along the way. So it definitely becomes real for us rather than strictly some, conceptual notion that's divorced from our regular experience.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Joseph. That's very good to clarify that. So I wanted to also address, because that has come up also in some pre-submitted questions, in terms of the moment we are in how can we feel that our practice matters, and in this time where there's so much collective pain and grief and violence and disregard for the climate. And so how can we practice with our emotions, but also feel that our practice matters?
Mm-hmm. No, that's a really important question, particularly in these times, which, as you mentioned, they're challenging on so many fronts. I mean, there's just so much suffering on so many different dimensions that are going on that it often feels overwhelming, So there are two stages, in a way, or aspects to the question. First is how we deal with the feelings that may be coming up for us. For a lot of people, there's just a lot of anxiety about what's going on, or sorrow, or fear, or unpleasant emotions. It's really important that we learn how to be with those emotions skillfully in a mindful way. Otherwise, we start drowning in them. They really can become overwhelming, which ties into the second part of the question. If we're simply overwhelmed by these feelings of distress, we have neither the energy nor the clarity to engage in addressing them. We're just we're sinking into, the morass of these feelings. So it's not helpful. It's not helpful for us personally, and it's not helpful for us in terms of actually engaging with the problems. So the first step is learning how, in our practice, we can be with the anxiety, or be with the grief, be with the sorrow, be with the fear. And there are just a couple of key points in learning how to work with them. One of them is just making space for the feeling. Instead of reacting to the unpleasantness, either by just being overwhelmed by it or having aversion to it. I hate these feelings. They're unpleasant. They're very unpleasant feelings. But both if we're identified with them or have aversion to them, we're actually feeding them. We're locking ourselves into them. So our practice is to make a lot of space. We sit, we settle into the awareness of the whole body, and then we may be experiencing the sensations of anxiety, or fear, whatever it may be. And they're unpleasant feelings. So we have to acknowledge that. But we can learn, and we do learn through our practice, that it's okay to feel them, even though they're unpleasant. It's like working with physical pain in the body. If we're always running away from it or having aversion to it, we're not opening to it and understanding it. And it's the same thing with these difficult emotions. It is possible, opening to the sensations of the anxiety. It feels like this, and softening in our relationship to them. It's okay to feel it. As we free ourselves from aversion toward them, or simply wanting to get rid of them, we're creating the space within us, within our bodies and minds, for them to be there. We're feeling them, we're open to them, and we're letting them wash through. Whereas if we're always with them so that they will go away, that is actually strengthening them. So this is I think, a really important understanding. And I worked with this a lot myself over the years. And it wasn't so much about current conditions, but at one point in my meditation practice, I was just experiencing a lot of fear. And there was no cause, no apparent cause for the fear. It was just some old conditioning coming up, but very intense. And for a long time, I thought I was being mindful, but I really wasn't, because I was watching it in order for it to go away. And I didn't even understand that. I thought because I recognized what was there, that was being mindful. But mindfulness, as I was suggesting earlier, has to do with the quality of acceptance. And it was, in working with the fear, it was only when I finally got to a place, it's okay to feel this. And I remember thinking there was a moment, if this fear is here for the rest of my life, it's okay. And that was the first moment in years of working with it that I was actually truly accepting. And it was amazing. In that moment of acceptance, that whole mass of fear just washed through, because I wasn't holding on to it through aversion. And it's not to say fear never comes back, but the relationship to it has really changed. Yeah. So it's the same thing with the anxiety, with the fear, with sorrow, with the grief, making space. When we have some openness to that, then there is more clarity and more openness for the possibility of compassionate response. Okay, given the situation in the world or in our relationships, whatever it is, okay, how can I help? Mm-hmm. Right? And so we hold that question as a motivation for actually doing something, for engaging. So the two are very related, how we're relating to our own emotions, getting space around them, becoming the framework for then engaging skillfully in the world.
Yeah. And the impact it has also in our day-to-day interactions and relations, because we're coming from a different place. So that's the influence we're having. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Joseph. So now we're going to take some questions from that were pre-submitted, and we're inviting people to please also ask questions in the chat under Ask Questions here. So one of the questions that it's a combined between several questions that relate to that. There's so many different ways of practicing, like the breath, sounds, choiceless awareness, metta. How do I decide on any given weekday which practice to use? And is there a progression from one practice to the other, or can the practice vary from day to day or even within a sit?
Okay, so it really depends on what kind of practices people are thinking about, because some practices really are quite different from one another, right? And so a lot of jumping back and forth in kind of a haphazard way between really quite different practices, I think is not that helpful. It just can create a lot of confusion and doubt, just as was indicated in the question. well, I wonder which should I do? Is this the right one? Maybe I should do the other one. And so we're just lost in, thinking about it. But for example, within the practice of mindfulness, this is just one example, very often people will raise the question, oh, shall I just stay with the breath or should I have a more open awareness? Well, these are both about the practice of mindfulness, and it's just how we're applying it. These two aspects, for example, can easily be interwoven between them. And I often do it myself. In a sitting, I may start out and just being with the breath for a while, and stabilizing that kind of one-pointedness on the breath. And then at a certain point, the mind may go to a more open, choiceless awareness, where it's still mindfulness, and it's still concentration, but a momentary concentration, which means the mind is concentrated on changing objects. So in that more open awareness, I may be aware also of the breath or different sensations or sounds as they arise and pass away. Then if in the open awareness it feels like we're just losing the steadiness, stability, we're beginning to space out, so then it's helpful to come back and just focus a little more just on the breath, to strengthen that concentration. So it's easy to interplay between the two. Just as a suggestion for when that might not be helpful is if you're kind of interweaving the directed awareness and the choiceless awareness. For example, it may be that you're just going back and forth too frequently, and the mind is starting to get confused or agitated or restless. So then that's an indication. You're doing too much. It's better just to stay with one of those aspects for a while, letting it settle. So the basic mantra that I apply with regard to this question is what works? What works to keep us most mindful? What works to keep the mind steady, and as concentrated as possible? And so we are, in a way, monitoring our own practice and choices. Is what we're doing really helping us or not? Is it just causing more confusion? So that becomes very important feedback. Mm-hmm. Just one other, with regard to this, in terms of doing or combining quite different practices, for example, the metta, the loving kindness or compassion. So that's very different than vipassana or mindfulness, but they're very supportive. The practice is very supportive. So very often people will take some time, maybe at the very beginning or the very end, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, however long, of doing just metta, or just compassion. But that's different than, we start with vipassana and then we get a little restless, then we start doing some metta. And then after a little metta, we go back to the vipassana. That kind of move is not that skillful. But to do it in a systematic way at the beginning or the end, I think could be supportive.
Okay, thank you. But there are also some even retreats or sometimes people choose to only practice metta for a while, right?
That also is a fantastic thing to do. And at one point, the metta practice has been hugely beneficial for me in my own practice, both for the development of the loving kindness, but also because it is a concentration practice. So when I first started, the first year of my practice, my mind just thought all the time. I had zero concentration. And I was kind of enjoying myself. I like to think that the hours went quickly, but I wasn't getting any place. And then I did 6 weeks of intensive metta practice. And it was through doing that, it was the first time my mind really experienced some level of concentration and understanding, oh, this is why people like to meditate, because the enjoyment of it comes as the mind settles down a bit and becomes more concentrated. So to do periods of just metta serves many purposes and could be really skillful.
Yeah. Thank you. So another question that has come up is, what is, I think you've addressed this a little bit, but maybe if you can go deeper on that, the difference between thinking or being aware of thoughts, I guess, or of, yeah, it's that the way it's phrased is thinking and being lost in thought.
Yeah, so
yeah,
that's a very important distinction. A very good indication of when or how not to be lost in thought is as soon as we become aware that a thought is present, it can be very helpful just to make a soft mental note of thinking. Oh, thinking, or if it's an image, seeing. Because in the moment of making the note, we are not lost in the thought. We are really being mindful that a thought is present. So that's a very simple way of strengthening our mindfulness of thought. Just one exercise, again, perhaps some people would find this interesting to do for a short period of time, but there's something, there's a little technique which I discovered, which I call the thought game. And that is, I would take a period of time in my sitting, maybe, for 15 minutes or so, and decide that all I was going to do was pay attention to the arising of thought. I wasn't going to be with the breath, not with the body. Now it's just sitting there waiting for thoughts to happen. So it's like sitting in a theater watching the screen, right? So sitting in meditation, watching the screen of the mind, and just sitting there waiting for the thought to appear. Because all of my attention was just waiting for the thoughts, my mind got very good at quickly picking them up, because I was just waiting for them to come. And some were really loud and, big on the screen. Some were like whispers, But they all became very apparent. And then I noticed that I needed a 360-degree screen, because sometimes thoughts would creep up from behind. I'm watching the screen in front, and then the thought, oh, I'm doing pretty good. So it's like, so I needed a wraparound screen. What it did, though, was just refine my sensitivity to the arising of thought. Because thought is difficult to become mindful of, especially right at the beginning. They just seem, as we all know, they just seem to slide in. It's not like a sound which makes an impact or a sensation. The thoughts don't seem to make much tangible impact. And that's why they're often there and we're not aware that they're there. So the noting or the thought game really could help. And then it becomes obvious the difference between when we're lost and we don't know they're there, and when we're aware, oh, there's a thought here.
Yeah. Yeah, and that loss of thought is what you described before also as a dream state.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So there are several questions. I think you already talked about this, but I guess people want to hear more about how to respond. How do you work with what's happening in the world right now? Violence, racism, injustice. How to break through those difficult emotions. I mean, I think you already spoke about it, but people are still asking about it. So.
Yeah. So I think there are two aspects I'll just highlight. One is an understanding of what gives rise to the feeling of compassion. Because compassion, like everything else, is a conditioned state, which means it arises because of certain conditions. One of the conditions for compassion to arise is our willingness to come close to or open to the suffering that's there. And this is not necessarily a given all the time, because sometimes, we may feel it's just too much. I need a break from this. I can't take this in. So we pull back, right? Or kind of try to avoid it for some time. Well, that also closes off, it caps the wellspring of compassion. So it's just to understand that part of what we can do, at least for as much as we can, and there may be certain limits to that, of just staying open, open to the truth and the experience and the manifestation of racism or climate change, so we don't close ourselves off to the awareness of this suffering. So that's one thing we can do. We actually practice staying open. And then if it does get overwhelming, then to pull back, to retreat for a while, to regain our balance, and then open again. Then when we actually are aware and connected in some way, we're feeling the suffering that's out there in so many different dimensions. As I mentioned before, the question that I really find so helpful is that simple question, well, given this, how can I help? And to really take that question on in a meaningful way and to explore, okay, is this something I can do? And sometimes there is something, sometimes there isn't. There are many things outside of our ability to change. So what I have found really helpful in the midst of all of these many problems in the world is to ask myself, okay, within my limited sphere of life and relationships and contact, within that, what can I do? How can I help? So it may be addressing on a very local level what may be a national problem, right? But we may not be able to solve the national problem, but we might be able to do something within our own sphere of life and activities. So for me, that's been really important. And I have asked myself that question, okay, here in Barrie, this is a small town, right? Right here, right locally, what can I do to help, with these worldly problems? So that, I think, gives energy then. And so we don't just get lost in the sorrow or the grief. Having learned how to be accepting of those feelings and then move from them into some level of engagement when we can.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Joseph.
Yeah.
So I think we have time for maybe a couple more questions, but one question that someone is asking, going back to the topic of the beginning of your practice, the early practice, if you can remember the challenges in the beginning that might be helpful to hear about for those friends who are just beginning their practice.
Yeah, well, there were a couple of challenges. One had to do with just the physical discomfort of sitting, because I was doing my early practice in India, and people generally were sitting cross-legged. I just, after 5 minutes or 10 minutes, it was just too painful. It was so, and this kind of may be representative of my personality. Okay, I can't sit cross-legged. I'm going to just find a comfortable chair, and just find a comfortable way of sitting. And even though in some traditions that might be frowned upon, it was just necessary. I had to accommodate my capabilities at the beginning, and sort of make the adjustment, of what allowed me to settle into the body in a more or less relaxed way. And then over time, I found, I could sit a little longer cross-legged, and until it became comfortable. Until many years later, in my older age, it was no longer possible. So I'm back to my early years of sitting in a chair. So it's adjusting. Mm-hmm. And the other big challenge, as I just mentioned, was just a lot of thought. My mind was very restless in that way. I was just sitting there thinking a lot. So then it's really finding ways, and there could be a lot of different approaches, but okay, what will be most effective in developing a little bit of concentration, And it might be doing the metta practice, for example. It might be techniques just of counting the breaths. There are a lot of suggestions out there of how we might strengthen concentration, but that's a very big help for our ongoing practice to begin to strengthen that capacity of the mind. Okay. And just by way of encouragement, if I can do it, anybody can do it, because I started with zero concentration. And it just took perseverance. I just kept going, and then finding a way. And slowly, that capacity grew. So it is possible for everyone.
Thank you. Yeah, that's encouraging for sure. So just another question. We might have a few minutes. If you can speak about interpersonal relationships and how it relates to change and groundlessness. Like, can relationships feel stable amidst changing phenomena? Or the nature of change and our relationships? That's the question, I guess.
Well, this question comes up, at different times. And I think, so first, one of the implications of the fact that everything is changing is that attachment to that which changes is the cause of suffering. If we're attached to summer, then we suffer in winter. If we're attached to youth, we suffer when we get old. It's just obvious. If we're holding on to what in its nature changes, we're going to suffer. So sometimes people then understand that and wonder, well, how does this apply to relationships, which are always in a process of change and transformation? Well, there's a difference between attachment and commitment. Right? Attachment is wanting things to stay a certain way. Well, for anybody who's been in a relationship, they know that is definitely a cause of suffering, because things don't stay the same. But that does not mean that we can't be committed in a relationship through all the ups and downs of the changes. So it's really bringing the wisdom of our practice and understanding that things change, and that we can learn not to be attached to things staying the same. Things are always becoming otherwise. But in our relationship, we've made a commitment. Okay, I'm gonna be here through all the ups and downs. And I think that's the basis of a healthy relationship.
Okay. Well, I think that's all the time we have for questions. But if we really thank everyone for your presence and for your generosity in supporting IMCW Second Sunday Dharma series fundraiser. And the recording of this event will be emailed to all registered within the week. But I think maybe in closing, Joseph, you can invite us to settle for a couple of minutes.
Yes, good idea. It's always nice just to settle back for a few minutes, let all the words settle. Yeah, so just become aware of your body and your body sitting. Become aware of the body breathing. Letting the breath just find its own natural rhythm. Nothing to force, nothing to want. May the merit of our time together, this Dharma discussion, be shared by all beings everywhere. May it be dedicated to the welfare, the happiness, and the liberation of all beings. May all beings everywhere be at peace. Thank you all. Pleasure to be with you.
Thank you so much, Joseph. And thank you, everyone, for your presence and for your participation. And may it be fruitful for all of you.